Hi there, I'm James Ryerson, and this is Lion Edit, a video series about popular scholarly writing, generously funded by the John Templeton Foundation. Who am I? I'm a newspaper and magazine editor. I've worked in the industry for more than 2 decades at a variety of publications. For the past 18 years, I've worked at the New York Times, first at the Sunday Magazine, and now at the Opinion Pages. In each episode of Lion Edit, I'll talk about my experience editing a specific piece by an academic I've worked with. These are short pieces for wide audiences about the big questions. Today, we are going to talk about a piece written for me in the opinion section of the New York Times by a social psychologist named David DeSteno. Dave is a psychologist I've worked with over the years on many different pieces. This particular piece was called What Science Can Learn from Religion. The subtitle was Hostility Toward Spiritual Traditions May Be Hampering Empirical Inquiry. If you're interested in finding out the full story behind this piece, you can check out my interview with Dave DeSteno on our Lion Edits podcast. So the argument that Dave wanted to make in the piece, and does make in the piece, is that science can learn something from religion. What is that something? Dave's particularly interested in the fact that social practices that you associate with religions, things like rituals or liturgies, things like that, can be seen as social interventions, ways of getting people to feel closer together, ways to get people to get through grief more effectively, ways for people to feel more empathy or compassion towards other people. And he looks at them simply as social practices. He strips them of whatever specific religious meaning they might have, and he looks at them as specific social practices, the kinds of things that a social psychologist, such as himself, can empirically test. And one thing that Dave's interested in is, do these rituals and religious practices and rites, do they have the effects that they're intended to have? Do they make people more compassionate? Do they make people feel a greater sense of solidarity with one another? Do they break down differences between people? This is something that in his research he's studied again and again. And in fact, he has found that in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, religious practices do precisely what they're intended to do. And he sees them as a kind of spiritual technology, a social practice that has been vindicated by empirical testing. And this is what he thinks science can learn from religion, specifically effective techniques and social practices for bringing about all kinds of goods that even non-religious people want to see promoted in society: compassion, solidarity, ability to get through tough times, things like that. When Dave first talked to me about wanting to do this piece, he rightly understood that the topic was big. It's science and religion. This is one way in which they might overlap. They might be part of the same conversation. They might have the same goals and ends. And in a larger social context in which science and religion are often seen as enemies or adversaries, or at the very least, not quite getting along as well as they might, he saw his work as offering a kind of an olive branch, a way in which both sides could see some kind of commonality. So when he first talked to me about it, we both agreed that it felt like a big story, something that maybe we could run on the cover story in Sunday Review. Those pieces run considerably longer than your average op-ed. Your average op-ed might be 800 words, 900 words, 1,000 words. A big cover story might be 1,500 words, 2,000 words. So I encouraged him to go big, and I encouraged him to do some reporting, talk to some scientists who are hostile towards religion, talk to religious leaders who are looking to make the faith more respectable, as it were, in the eyes of scientists, to really broaden it, tell a big story about how his work fits in. That was the original goal, and that was the intent behind the draft that he first filed for me. What we're going to do here today is we're going to take a look at Dave's initial draft, and then we're going to take a look at the final version of the piece. And we're going to show as much as possible as we can in this short video how it went from one to the other. And what we're going to do is focus on 3 particular kinds of edits. We're going to talk about one big picture edit, something that really affected the whole kind of structure and arc and pacing of the piece. Then we're going to talk about a mid-size edit, something that really went to the heart and substance of the piece, but didn't necessarily dictate the entire shape of the piece. That's a kind of mid-size edit. And then we're going to talk about a small edit. We're going to talk about something that might have happened at the size of a sentence or even just a word that nonetheless shows us something key that had to be done in the editing process to make the piece work as well as it ultimately did. And I hope that one thing I can do in talking through these 3 particular types of edits with this particular piece is give scholars who want to write for a popular audience just 3 pointers on things that come up a lot in pieces by academics writing in the pages of the New York Times and elsewhere. So for my first edit point here, I want to talk about a big picture edit. You'll notice that I asked Dave to go big with this piece, and he did. He opens with a very wide frame. For the first, I think, 4 paragraphs here, he's talking about all the different ways in which science and religion can relate. In fact, he's talking about the way they've related over time, the way they may have related in more recent years, ways in which they do get along, ways in which they don't get along. And it's very interesting, but you don't know where he's going. And it's not until the 5th paragraph that he really says, today, unfortunately, science and religion seem to be really pulling away from each other. Their mutual recriminations are more intense than ever. And to me, this is the point where the story really gets going. This is what Dave wants to talk about. He wants to say science and religion look like they're not getting along. I've got an olive branch here. I've got a way in which there's a lot that they have to say to each other. So my suggestion for Dave was to get rid of all the throat clearing and start right then and there. Where are we today? What's going on? The two sides are pulling each other apart. I've got a solution here. I've got something to say that will bring people together. That's the point that I feel like the piece was trying to make. And ultimately, I decided that's where we really should begin the piece. I think the general lesson here, particularly for academics, but not exclusively, but you'll see this a lot in scholarly contexts, is there's a real sense that it's important to give the lay of the land, to talk about all the relevant issues, to frame it as broadly as possible, and then to narrow down to the specific intervention that you're going to make. In a journalistic context, unfortunately, that sounds a lot like, here are all the things I'm not going to talk about. So the reader doesn't really want to go on a journey that kind of shows all the possible stories that Dave could tell. The reader wants to go on the journey that takes them on the story that Dave does tell. And that was the real thinking behind starting the piece, basically right here at the 5th paragraph. So if you look at the first sentence of the 5th paragraph, Dave writes, "Yet just when we might profitably try to foster an interchange of ideas between the scientifically and theologically inclined, the two sides seem to be getting ever more tribal in their recriminations." And so in the Ultimate Times piece, we simply began with the sentence, "Science and religion seem to be getting ever more tribal in their mutual recriminations, at least among hardline advocates." So for the second edit, I want to focus on a mid-sized intervention here. I want to talk about an edit we made that really affected not so much the big structure of the piece or the overall framing of the piece, but really just what is the heart of the piece. In the original draft, paragraphs, I believe 7 through 10, Dave lays out 3 possible arguments that he could be making about science and religion. The first is about whether science can tell us anything about the nature of God. He quickly rules that out. The second is about whether science and religion have certain preoccupations in common, things like the nature of compassion, empathy, and how to promote those in a community. He notes that those are areas of common interest. In his third point, he makes the point that, as I mentioned earlier, is really the crux of the whole piece. He says there's a way of looking at religious practices as if they are specific social interventions. And once you look at them that way, they're amenable to empirical tests. You can find out if they are effective, what kinds of effects they have. In the final edit, we simply got rid of points 1 and 2. Point 1, as Dave himself noted, is irrelevant. He says science doesn't have anything to say about the nature of God, so we get rid of it. Point 2, it's a little closer to what Dave wants to argue. There's certain thematic overlaps between religion and its preoccupations and social science and its preoccupations. But again, they're just vague overlaps. We get rid of it. In the end, we dive right into his ultimate point that religious practices, religious rites, religious rituals can be seen as kind of spiritual technologies that either work or don't, as empirical science can tell us. In the ultimate published version of the piece, you'll see that rather than taking till paragraph 10 to talk about religious traditions offering us a kind of set of hypotheses that science can test, it happens in the final piece by a paragraph 3. He gets to that point rather quickly. The general lesson here for popular writing, especially these short op-ed type pieces, is start where the action is. It's related to the point we were making before. We don't need throat clearing. We don't need you to tell us what you're not going to tell us about. And then even when you are going to tell us what you're telling us about, if you've got 3 different versions of points that you could make, start where the action is. I often say an op-ed is at most one idea. You don't really have time to make all the different arguments. Look for your most exciting argument, your most original argument, your core argument, the argument you really want to make, and start that as soon as possible. Sometimes you might find a chance later in the piece to tuck in one of your other arguments or gesture at it, but you got to start where the action is. You'll find out later if you have time to say anything else. For the third edit, I want to talk about a small edit, something on the size of maybe a sentence or even a word. In this case, it's about a sentence. In Dave's original draft, I think in graph 13, it's 3 paragraphs from the end, he says, before closing, I want to make one point exceedingly clear. I am in no way an apologist for religion. And you'll see in the final published version that is not the 13th paragraph. That is the first sentence of the second paragraph. It simply begins, I am no apologist for religion. As a psychologist, I believe that the scientific method provides the best tools with which to unlock the secrets of human nature. So why did I move that one sentence from way back in the piece to basically the very front of the piece? In this case, I did it because in Dave's piece, part of what's really interesting about his argument is that he's saying that science can learn something from religion. And a reader might think that he's saying that because he's a scientist who is himself particularly invested in religion. Maybe he's a religious person himself, or maybe he just believes that it's incredibly important for society that people practice religions. Doesn't really matter. Your first thought might be, well, if this is a scientist and he thinks science has something to learn from religion, you think, oh, I'm dealing with that kind of person, someone who's already all in on religion. It's very key to Dave's argument, both for its rhetorical power, but also because of the substance of what he's trying to actually argue, that he's agnostic, as it were, on the question of religion. He thinks religion might be good. He thinks it might be bad. He thinks it might be complicated. He himself doesn't really have a dog in that hunt. What he's saying is that as a scientist, he turns to religion for a store of hypotheses about what might work in certain social situations to bring about empathy, compassion, so on and so forth. That's what's really interesting about his piece. If he saves that for the very end of the piece, the reader is left in the dark, not just about where he stands, which is interesting, but they're left in the dark about the nature of the piece ultimately. The nature of the argument is really, even if you don't care about religion, there's a lot that religion can tell you as a scientist that it can offer you. I think what we're talking about here with this particular point is it can be generalized, which is when to use your kind of vantage point and your perspective. In a standard op-ed, let's say you're writing a piece about labor economics and you're a labor economist, it's going to say in your bio that you're a labor economist. And there's nothing particularly surprising about the fact that you've written a whole piece about labor economics and you're a labor economist. This is a different kind of piece. Dave's a social psychologist, but that doesn't tell you everything about what's interesting about his vantage point. What makes this piece interesting is that he's talking about the value of religion from a scientific point of view, and he is a scientist who doesn't particularly care one way or the other about religion. That's key. And in general, if your perspective, if your vantage point is part of what's interesting about the argument you're making, you want to signal that as soon as possible. Here's another simple example. If you're a Republican economist who's worked for many different Republican administrations, and you're a hardline free marketer on most issues, but on one particular policy that comes up, you are totally in line with the Democrats on that. It's useful to signal early on, hey, I'm a diehard free market, libertarian-minded economist. I've worked with Republican administrations for many years. But in this case, there's something about this particular policy that I think, despite my general orientation, it cuts in the other direction. And that's part of what's going to make that argument interesting, is that you're speaking about that issue from your particular vantage point. So in those cases, it's very important to signal that as soon as possible. That's often what's really interesting about the argument, is that you are the person making it, or that your vantage point is particularly interesting. Thanks again for joining us for Line Edit. We are very grateful to the public engagement team at the John Templeton Foundation, who made this project and its associated podcasts possible. Thanks as well to Professor Lisa Feldman-Barrett at Northeastern University. Northeastern administers our grant. Of course, we couldn't have done this without the generosity of Dave DeSteno, who graciously allowed us to look under the microscope at his first draft and the final product. The video was hosted and produced by me, James Ryerson, and produced and edited by Joseph Fridman. Happy writing.